morning. Let me rephrase that. It's morning. I'm not much of a morning person. I never have been. And it really is, as much as it's an honor to be here to speak to you today, it was definitely, oh, thank you, I need that. It was definitely a very well-timed moment of vulnerability when Tina asked me to do this. It was a couple of weeks ago, and I was hungover and eating dim sum. And in a spirit of enthusiastic self-sabotage, I agreed, and the reason I hesitated, because what an incredible building and room and everything, is because, as Tina mentioned, I knew that it was this morning and that last night was going to be the opening of my first solo show in New York, and I thought to myself, maybe if I know that I'm doing this in the morning, I would take it easy on myself last night. And you'd think I'd know myself by now. Here we are, I find myself in another well-timed moment of hungover vulnerability. Unlike Tina, I'm not giving out any hugs. Yeah, not a morning person. I can say that with all certainty now. I know this to be true because the small people in my life like to daily reel against existence before even the fucking birds are up. And you find out a lot about yourself at 4 in the morning. But yeah, so I was given a theme to talk about today, and let's just go ahead and pretend that's what I did. I actually kind of forgot I was given a theme. But yeah, so as Tina pointed out, my name is Oliver Jeffers. That's what it says on my driver's license. And I'm here today talking to you. I took a guess where I'd be standing. I was like, I didn't know the odds were going to be in my favor, so I'm triply correct now. So, hi. The reason that I speak the way that I do is because I'm from a place called Belfast in Northern Ireland. I fully assume that she is signing in a Belfast accent. Yeah. You're sign languaging with a Belfast accent, yes? Great. Yeah. So, Belfast, little town in a country called Northern Ireland, which is right around there. Some more context if you need it. If you're wondering what all those other bits are. But let's zoom in for a closer look. There she is. That's the city of my childhood. So I grew up there in the late 1970s and 1980s, and it was a pretty violent place back then. But despite all of that, I actually had a very normal upbringing, and I have a lovely, normal family. What's normal anyway? I have never actually trusted normal people. I think they have something to hide. Ever since I can remember, I've always loved drawing. I've always loved drawing pictures, and I always knew that I wanted to be an artist whenever I grew up. Didn't mean that I started out any good, although this isn't bad. I made this when I was 6 months old. So, a genius, my parents called me. But then I didn't progress so much for a long time. I made this when I was 16 years old. And it's not very good. It's not a great drawing of a person. And the reason for that is because it's before I went to art college. And then I went to art college for 4 years, and I studied form and function and light and shadow and perspective and art history, and now I draw like this. One question I get asked an awful lot, mostly by children, is, can you really draw feet? Let the record show that yes, I actually can. Although I can't count toes very well. But in reality, I can draw feet. I can paint shoes anyway. But I have always juggled several separate careers. I like to turn my hand to an oil painting and drawing shoes and portraits, and I can turn my hand to a still life and landscape and all sorts of other types of paintings, but never just straight, never just something for the sake of it. It's always with a twist, like this is a painting called A Portrait with Adriana in 3 parts, and I painted my friend 3 times and then slowly painted over her, and instead of showing the painting, those numbers are all Pantone numbers. You're given the Pantone number and location, so in theory it's the same information, but just presented in a totally different way. Or like these dipped portraits. So I paint portraits of people, and then as an exploration of loss and memory and identity, I fully paint the portraits, and in front of a small audience, I submerge them into a vat of paint to cover them like this, and then interview the people who were there afterwards to see what they can remember. And not a lot is the conclusion so far. Memory is a very malleable, self-serving, kind of imperfect thing, which makes eyewitness testimony remarkably unreliable. But one of the reasons I got the idea to dip a portrait in the first place was I made a piece of art called Portrait with Jesus and Hidden Variables. And hidden variables are this neat little section of quantum physics, a carpet, if you will, where things are brushed under that we don't quite make sense of. It's effectively things that are happening, but we don't really know what they are. A lot of religious people started to say, well, there is scientific proof that God exists, whereas the scientific community were saying, well, no, not so much as it just proves that we don't know everything yet. And so I made this piece of art. It was displayed in New York, and in the first couple of days that it was exhibited, somebody took it off the wall and ripped it in half. And I never saw the top half again. I don't know whether they were offended on religious grounds or on scientific grounds. I can probably hazard a guess, but I decided in the true spirit of scientific endeavor that I took the bottom half and remade it, called Portrait with Jesus and Hidden Variables, Take 2. This time I drew in painstakingly the portrait to paint over again. So yeah, pencils, paints. I like making art out of all sorts of different stuff. Something I am a big fan of is collecting old paintings that people leave lying on the streets, and then painting in seemingly mostly Titanics in them. This is Lost at Stream, Lost at Sand, Lost at Falls, Lost at Tree. So you get the idea. I like to just entertain myself, basically. I like to make drawings that, just for the fun of it. I've always liked labeling things. This really is the way that I write, and it's being in a small studio. It's always very important to know where things are. Guess what I keep in this box? Anyway, so yeah, writing, telling stories, all sorts. I think that was me. But it's probably making picture books that I think, maybe best known for. I've made, at this point, 16, I think, picture books that I've written and illustrated. And to an extent, all of the stories I tell are true stories. Totally true. Sort of. I exaggerate a little bit sometimes. I did hear this an awful lot when I was growing up. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I heard this all the time growing up by my father, and something I've often repeated, although recently I've had to make a caveat. Or two. I don't know about you, but things have been getting a bit weird in recent years, all over the place. And anybody who follows me on social media knows that over the last couple of years, I've become quite vocal about social issues, current affairs around the world, and there are a couple of different reasons for this. Firstly, because it seems to me like a lot of really messed up things have been happening across Western civilization in the last few years. Like, for example, this country choosing a bigoted, racist, narcissistic bully to lead the country. And if there's anyone here who voted for him, even you can't disagree with that without being self-delusional. But also, on the other side of the Atlantic, like Britain choosing to sever themselves with deliberately misleading information, to sever themselves into a world of economic and cultural isolation. And you think here's a mess? It's a fucking mess there. And it's kind of funny, actually, that Northern Ireland, our little corner of Northwest Europe, whenever this vote was taking place, not one person in the mainland of Great Britain thought about Northern Ireland. United Kingdom of Great Britain, and is there supposed to be another bit? And it's kind of funny now that Northern Ireland is actually the spanner in the works for the whole thing, because not anybody thought about what would happen in that border between the north and south of Ireland. That was a very difficult fought 30-year negotiation. It's a mess that will take generations to fix. And anyway, while all these things seem bad, they probably are bad, maybe I've been feeling them a little more innately than I would have otherwise, because just over 3 years ago, my wife and I had a baby who sounded like this. Any of you, anybody here who has kids? Anybody here have kids? Okay, you kind of know that it sort of changes everything. And all of you people who didn't put your hands up, it's okay. I already know that your favorite thing is to listen to people who do have children talk about their offspring. Well, to be fair, he wasn't always crying. So we had a baby, and I was feeling these things. And as somebody who primarily makes books that are mostly enjoyed by children, one thing that I got asked almost straight away was, would this change the way that I would make books? And I legitimately did not know for a long time whether it would or whether it wouldn't. And it turns out that the answer is yes, but not in the way that I expected. See, as we brought him home from the hospital, as I'm wont to do, I started to give him a tour of where he lived. So we brought him home. He's 2 days old. I was like, well, son, here we are. This is your apartment. This is the front door. This is the kitchen. This is our collection of chairs. And something struck me that he really didn't know anything. He was a complete blank slate, and that all new humans are. They truly know nothing when they first show up, other than how to do this. And sometimes this. So, anyway, he didn't know anything about being here, and he was this tiny little fragile ball of entirely new life that was just a bunch of atoms and potential and the hope that we were putting in him. And while it sort of began as a comedy, me giving him a tour and explaining things that he clearly had no grasp of, the actual weight of that responsibility started to reveal itself to me, and I realized that I was going to have to teach him all these things, and me and his mother and his community, and that I would have to sort of explain everything to him, be his tour guide as such, explain all sorts of things like where Belfast is, for example, and I was doing that. As I was walking around explaining things, I would sort of, point things out as we were taking him around the place, and it's a wonderful refresher course explaining things to a 0-year-old. So a lot of things that you think that you know, turns out that you don't actually know. And it forces on you this perspective, this interesting perspective, that while at one point is entirely insular and tiny, and at the same time it's massively external when you start to consider your place, not just in this planet, but this planet's place in the universe. And the true scale of things kind of reveals itself to you for a split second, almost like seeing an eclipse of the sun, which is something that we went to do last summer. We went to Tennessee, where we were in the path of totality. Did anybody here see the eclipse in totality? It's a remarkable thing.
Wow.
Like for 2 minutes in the middle of the day, I'll turn that down. For 2 minutes in the middle of the day, it becomes so dark, it's like nighttime. And there's this giant hole in the sky. You cannot explain it. And as your brain is processing what it's witnessing, basically two floating celestial orbs at vast distances, for a split second you get a sense of that actual distance. This strange thing happens, this paradigm shift, this kind of perspective shift occurs. And it's remarkable. And even if you just think about that for a second, to clearly see the scale of things for a few moments. So for comparison's sake, let's say the sun is the size of a dinner plate. That would mean that planet Earth is the size of a pea, and that the moon is the size of a poppy seed. Or a sesame seed. No, poppy seed's smaller, it's the one. Just imagine how far away that dinner plate has to be so that it looks like it's the same size as the poppy seed. The sun is 400 times further away from us than the moon, but completely coincidentally, the moon is exactly 400 times smaller than the sun, so they appear exactly the same size. And using a model at this scale, you would need 6 miles just to show our solar system. And that's one solar system among many in our galaxy, which is one among trillions in the cosmos. And to use another scale for a second, say you take just the Earth and the moon. With a globe of Earth that is around 8 feet in diameter, the moon, which in reality is almost 2,500 miles in diameter, which is roughly the same width as the United States. So at that scale, it would be a city block away and 2 feet in diameter. And I know this because I am building a model like this that is going to be, it's a piece of public art that's going to be installed on the High Line in about 2 weeks. Thank you, yeah. So the Earth will be 8 feet in diameter, and on 16th Street in the High Line, and then on 15th Street will be the moon, which will be 2 feet in diameter. Every border will be drawn onto planet Earth, but instead of denoting what countries live inside those lines, I'm simply repeating over and over again that people live here. It's been timed to coincide with the 50th anniversary of this photograph, the Earthrise photograph that was taken in the Apollo 8 mission in the winter of 1968, 1969. And the whole time that they were preparing for this mission, their thoughts were on the moon and the stars, according to Bill Anders, who was one of the astronauts on that mission. But looking back on the Earth, they realized afterwards was the most important reason that they went. This actually is an edited version of the photograph that Time magazine edited at the time. That's the original one that they decided it looked better if they flipped it and sort of did that. But anyway, it gave birth to something that's known as the overview effect, which is this sort of cognitive shift in perspective that gives an understanding that the Earth is a single system, that we're part of this giant superorganism. In the first days in outer space, astronauts historically get up there and they see the Earth sort of floating below them, and they point out their home cities and their home countries. And then inevitably by the end of the second week, they figure out that, no, that object there, that's our home. This planet alone is their home, the slow realization. And it sort of knocks a bit of perspective into things, really, doesn't it? Whenever you're wondering, what shoes you'll buy, or who's going to pay for dinner tonight, or why more people didn't come to your party. When you're looking at things from that vast of a perspective, the things that don't matter tend to fall away, like the importance of borders. In my opinion, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel, as said by Samuel Johnson in 1775. And the things that really do matter when you think about it tend to rightly come to the surface from that perspective, like being responsible for other human life. So as I was walking around in the first few weeks of our son's life, pointing out these fairly obvious things to him, like that's a tree, that's the sun, it's daytime, it's nighttime, it occurred to me that maybe because I had a new filter and everything because of this parental perspective, or maybe it was a reaction to this wave of xenophobia that's sweeping across Western civilization, I wanted to something became increasingly clear to me when I was trying to explain these things, that, and it's really quite obvious when it's said aloud, that we're all kind of greedy when the truth is told. It's funny how we teach our kids to share when we as adults tend to often not do that very much. Technically, there is enough for everybody if we all budge up, but greed, I think, is a survival mechanism that has served us well as a species, but it's a survival mechanism that doesn't seem to have an off switch, and that's where it goes wrong a little bit. Whenever you ask people if they have enough, the answer always tends to be, well, if I just had a little more. Reminded me of a fantastic poem written by Kurt Vonnegut called Joe Heller. True story, word of honor. Joseph Heller, an important and funny writer, now dead, and I were at a party given by a billionaire at Shelter Island. I said, Joe, how does it make you feel to know that our host only yesterday may have made more money than your novel Catch-22 has earned in its entire history? And Joe said, I've got something he can never have. And I said, what on earth could that be, Joe? And Joe said, the knowledge that I've got enough. Not bad, Joe. Rest in peace. Greed leads to fear, which leads to hate, which leads to walls. I began feeling a little despondent about this and other things, and I always never thought it was my place to speak up about things, because, who was I? None of my business to inform people of my personal opinions on matters, but I never thought it was my place to weigh in a topic or issue that was sort of outside of the range of my practice. But then again, it occurred to me, who was I not to say? As things started becoming a little more scary across the world, it felt like I had to speak up. I wanted to be able to look my children in the eye in years to come and say that I didn't just stay silent. So I started posting things on social media that represented how I felt about things, and it's been incredible actually getting some conversations going that are not just adding to the noise, but are asked in sincerity and engaging in conversation. And personally, I feel that climate change is actually the biggest issue that humanity faces. To follow on a concept that Buckminster Fuller offered up in the 1960s, if our planet were a mechanical vehicle, it seems that we are way too distracted arguing over what to play on the radio to notice the smoke coming out of the engine. It's the really not very far into the future consequences of our current actions or lack of actions are a little bit terrifying. We won't be able to have border disputes if we're all underwater. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And that's my child, that's my boy recently. And much of the energy from these social media posts got put into what then became this book that I was making for him, which started out teaching him the very basic things to new life, but then worked on a dual level of reminding myself and anybody else who wanted to be reminded of the simple basic principles of what it is to be a human being living on Earth. And I started making him a guide of these simple things that became a book called Here We Are, Notes for Living on Planet Earth. And it's quite basic, and it stays quite basic. There's nothing in there that isn't absolutely factually accurate. People come in many shapes, sizes, and colors. We may all look different, act different, and sound different, but don't be fooled. We are all people. I felt that this book became my kind of manifesto for hope and inclusion. And we have a daughter now, too, who's just turned 1 at the weekend there. And I think perhaps for the first time in a long time, it might be a good time to be raising a girl in what will hopefully soon no longer be a man's world. Yeah, I'm sure you've all figured out men are idiots. I want my children to know, and somebody asked me once, what's the most simple takeaway point that this book could offer your children? I was like, I want them to know this, that while they are unique, wonderful human beings, and as we all feel about ourselves, we're all playing the starring role in the film of our lives, I wanted them to know that they are one of 7.5 billion people living on this planet. Actually, so an interesting aside, the 2 years separating the birth of both of my children, the population of the Earth rose by 200 million people in 2 years. And we have nowhere else to go. We're all living on this planet, we have nowhere else to go. To drive this point home, on this pale blue dot, everyone you know, everyone you love, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, as said by Carl Sagan. There is that blue dot, that's where we all live, every one of us, and including somewhere on here is this guy. Humanity is a wonderful thing. But as I mentioned, last night was the opening of my first solo show of paintings in New York, and Bryce Walkowitz, golly, thank you. And the show is called For All We Know, which, when it's said as a statement, means the sum total of all knowledge. But whenever you phrase it as a question, it means we know absolutely nothing. And from the first people who ever attempted to make sense out of chaos by drawing lines between those lights in the sky, we have always made connections. We've connected ourselves to everything and everything to ourselves. We've looked back at where we've come from to know who we are and who we're not. And we've drawn lines across the land to know where we belong, where we don't. And here on this slowly revolving sphere, floating in a very cold and lonely dark, with the engine overheating and nobody paying attention, These lines that divide us and those lines that connect the stars live merely in the minds of man. We are the stories we tell. We are the stories we're told. Vividly burning and hauntingly brief. And the most powerful thing that has occurred to me recently is that we can change the stories we tell, especially to our children, but also to ourselves. Sure, it's all made up anyway. And that's all I have to say on the matter. Thank you.